Hello and welcome to the Marlborough Book Festival podcast, the place where you can hear writers talk about their work, their lives, and the inspiration behind their writing. I'm Claudia, the treasurer for the committee, and today I'm thrilled to be introducing the amazing Dame Fiona Kidman, speaking about her book, All the Way to Summer. Dame Fiona marked her 80th birthday last year with the publication of All the Way to Summer, a beautiful volume of stories, all moving, insightful, and written with love. The final stories trace her own history of love, a memoir of significant people from childhood and beyond. The collection is the perfect starting point for a conversation about her extraordinary life. The conversation was recorded at the 2021 Marlborough Book Festival, an annual weekend of wonderful writers, curious audiences, and beautiful Marlborough. The festival is aimed at anyone who loves great writers and writing. If you haven't read the book before the session, you'll definitely want to afterwards. For now, please enjoy Dame Fiona Kidman speaking to Tessa Nicholson.
My name's Tessa Nicholson and I'm the MC for this session with Dame Fiona Kidman. There will be time for questions at the end of the session, and there are a couple of Fiona's books for sale. She did a session yesterday and sold out of a number of others, but there were two very good books out there for sale after the session, and Fiona is more than happy to sign them for you. Welcome, Morena. Dame Fiona, it's been 7 years, the very first festival, 2014, Marlborough Book Festival, you were here. You've been very busy since then. There's been a couple of novels and there's been this latest book, which I think is rather lovely. Dame Fiona turned 80 last year, and instead of us giving her presents, she gave us this present, and it's called All the Way to Summer. It's a collection of short stories and of love and longing. Now, with the title, why did you choose this title, this story, as your actual title for the book?
Well, first of all, may I say tēnā koutou katoa, and it's just, again, how lovely it is to be here in Marlborough, and I'm having such a lovely weekend. And thank you for getting up early and braving this very cool and lovely but bracing Blenheim morning to be here so early. It's just great. All the Way to Summer, I chose that particular title because the story that it reflects, it's the title story of a particular story which is really autobiographical. Of course, fiction writers say they're not in their stories, and yesterday I spent some time managing. I hoped to convince my audience that it wasn't me and my stories at all. But in this particular book, quite a few of the stories are about me, and they are a kind of a statement when having arrived at the age of 80 that there are things that I wanted to say about myself. And All the Way to Summer is about my childhood, about growing up in the far north of New Zealand, in rather odd circumstances, and being considered a slightly odd little girl, only child, who did weird things like divining water, and had parents who were going through a crisis in their lives. It was straight after World War II, and we were living in Kirikiri, which, again, I mentioned yesterday, was a rather interesting town divided by class, in the sense that there were a lot of Raj people, ex-military people who'd been in Tianjin and Shanghai and were leaving at the end of the Japanese-Sino wars, and wanted somewhere nice to come that had a nice climate. They didn't want to go back to Britain. And they wanted a nice climate, and they wanted a place where essentially they had servants. And my parents were in a rather invidious situation at that time in their lives, and they were servant people. But the mother is a strong-minded person, and that certainly reflects my mother, and she's kicking against the traces a little bit. And the child in the story, she is finding her way and establishing herself as being a little bit different and also considered a bit difficult, which I think I have to confess is pretty much myself. So it was a statement about myself and my family, really, and it's important to me.
These are a collection of new short stories, but there's also a number of older short stories. So
Yes.
how did you choose which ones to include in this book?
Because I went back through my several collections, and there are some stories which I really wanted to present again. Short stories are notoriously the difficult things to sell, or so your publishers tell you. I love short stories, but when you say that you want to do short stories, your editor sort of rolls her eyes, and if you're you've been publishing with them for a long time, they'll say, well, perhaps we'll do a collection now. Can you find a particular selling point for them? And so quite often you'll find that short stories have connecting threads in them these days. There are not a lot of recent collections where every story is totally standalone. So this one has the theme of love and longing. And arriving at 80, I think there are a lot of things that one can complain about in their lives, but there's also a great deal of good fortune that you can look back upon. And I tend to think that I've had a lucky and loving life, and I wanted to reflect that in the stories that I was presenting. The older stories, all the stories are rewritten from the bottom up.
I was going to ask that. You've refreshed them. Why did you refresh them? Because since you wrote them, times have changed, or you've changed about the way you felt about them?
I think I wish that I had the craft that I had to go with the energy that I had when I was a young writer. I look back on some of and so there's nothing that's actually changed. The stories are actually everything happens exactly as they did in the original stories. But I've just gone through word by word, and one of the things I'm very strong about is when people ask for advice about writing, I say there's all sorts of things that I could say, but I say look for strong verbs and get rid of adverbs, and meaning show, don't tell, and so that you can put new life into a piece of fiction if you freshen up the verbs. And if somebody, instead of somebody saying something all the time, if they blurt it or they shout it or they shriek it or so, that can be far more interesting and lively. So I was just going through and also looking for things with more interesting grammatical constructions.
Well, you started writing in 1979. You just said you wish you'd had the craft that you had with the energy back when you started, when your first book was published in 79, I should say. But has your style changed a lot over the years?
Well, I think the voice is the same. I mean, you're given one voice, I think, and essentially the themes and preoccupations of a lifetime don't really change. I should say that I have actually been writing since I was 22. I started to seriously call myself a writer when I was 22 years of age. I was listening at the time to... what had happened was that I was working, I was a librarian, and I worked in a public library until I was about the ripe old age of 20, the year I got married. And I then went to work as a librarian at a boys' high school. And after a year or so, I became pregnant. And in those days, this was 1962, you didn't be pregnant in a boys' high school. And the principal suggested to me kindly that I might like to go home and knit some booties.
I bet that went down well.
Because I should add that my husband was teaching there too. So you know, it was the evidence that we actually had sexual intercourse.
Not allowed in 1962.
So it was better that I went home, and of course he kept his job. But anyway, so I started painfully to do some pale green moss-stitched matinee jackets. I've not ever been very skillful in that direction. And playing on radio at the time was the Pencaro series. I don't know whether any of you remember Nell Scanlon and the Pencaro series. Great stories about rural New Zealand women's lives. And I thought, oh, this is about New Zealand. This is about women's lives. This is like my mother's life. And I thought I could do that. And so there was a competition running at the time in Rotorua, where I lived there. The local theatre was running a competition for a play. So I went in for it, and I thought, well, just write about the things you know. I mean, obviously Nell Scanlon does. But just going back a little bit, before I met and married my husband, I had run with the local rugby clubs. And so I wrote a play, sort of a forerunner, I suppose, to Foreskin's Lament. But seen from a girl's eye perspective. And the play came back with the comment that this, and I have said this before, so forgive me if I've said, you've heard me say it before, but it came back with the judge's comment that this must have been written by the dirtiest-minded young woman in New Zealand.
But it goes further, because later you were called Filthy Fiona.
Oh, I've been called Filthy Fiona. I've been called all sorts of things, yeah.
And I mean, we look at you and we think, seriously, this is only 40, 50 years ago?
And seriously, I'm a nice old woman.
I can imagine you knitting booties now.
Never learn.
There are, as you say, so many autobiographical stories in here, and there are also some very new stories which must have been quite hard for you to write. Silks and Stippled is about events that... Silks, it's Vietnam. Ian was very, very ill, and you thought you were going to lose him there. And Stippled, the last one, is Ian's death, and it's... How hard were they to write?
I think sometimes because words have always been what I did, and there's a compulsion, there's simply a compulsion to find a way to express the inexpressible, the things that are very difficult to talk about and very difficult to live with. So Silks is about a trip that Ian, my late husband, who was here with me at the first festival 7 years ago, and we had the most wonderful time here together. And just again, I digress all over the place. The wonderful thing I had was just released the Infinite Air, my Jean Batten novel, and your wonderful festival organisers organised for me to fly over Blenheim in a two-seater plane with a helmet and a long white scarf flowing behind me. You can put that up if you like, because I thought I'd just bring it back for old times' sake. So that's us. Yeah. But you can take it down.
I quite like it up there.
Yeah. So Ian died suddenly about three years ago, but before that and after the I'm trying to think of the sequence of events now. It must have been before we came to Blenheim. We had gone on a trip to Hanoi. Ian travelled extensively in Asia. He was a voluntary worker for an NGO called the Cambodia Trust, and it had a Cambodia Trust Aotearoa branch in New Zealand. So he used to go up to, it was to do with working with limb fitting a limb fitting centre, so people who'd had lost limbs in mines, you'll know about all the mines that blow up in Cambodia perhaps. So he would go up to Cambodia 2 or 3 times a year, and on what was to be his last trip, because he was starting to fail a little bit and the trips were not as easy. We hadn't been to Hanoi together. We'd been to Vietnam a number of times. I have a particular passion about Vietnam, but I can come back to that as a sort of slightly separate subject. We agreed that I would go up to, I'd go up to Bangkok and he'd fly from Phnom Penh and meet me in the airport in Bangkok, and we'd fly on to Hanoi together. All of which we did, except that I saw him in the airport in Bangkok, and I realised that he was not himself. There was something quite odd about him, but he insisted that he'd be fine when he got on the plane and we got to Hanoi. But he wasn't. He just became more and more ill, and we finished up we landed up later that night in the French Hanoi hospital, where he nearly died, and he was there for 3 weeks. He'd caught a virus which had, a terrible virus which had, his kidneys had started to fail. So it was a very terrifying experience. However, he did recover. He was a strong old man. And it recounts really my experience of spending those weeks in Hanoi and coming to terms with the possibility of his death and thinking about our lives together. And various things happen along the way. What actually drew me to Vietnam, I've had a strange lifelong obsession with the French writer Marguerite Duras, who was a novelist who wrote a famous book and film called The Lover, and also one called, but right back when I was a very young woman, she wrote the screenplay for a film called Hiroshima Mon Amour. And I became a bit obsessed with her life, and I started tracking around the places that she had been. And she had been born along the Mekong River near Saigon, or what is now Ho Chi Minh City. So that was one of the places that I had been to quite early in the early 90s, 1992, I think. Went to Ho Chi Minh City when it was still very Wild West, and hired a flat-bottomed barge and went up the Mekong to look for the place where she was born. And then her mother had worked in a boarding house which had echoes of my mother's life too, in Hanoi. So I'd actually wanted to go to Hanoi to find the boarding house.
Oh, did you find it?
I don't know. Events overtook me. Events totally overtook me. I think I saw the lake that it was beside, but who knows? Who
knows now? Yeah. You said you love short stories. Do you prefer writing short stories to maybe a novel?
I would have said so earlier in my writing life. I'm not sure that I do now. In a novel, you have lots of corners to hide.
True.
You have some corners to hide. You don't in a short story. The short story has to work all the way through. I'm not saying that you shouldn't strive for perfection in a novel, but there are just the exactness needed for a short story. I think as I get older, I find that, mind you, the last one, Stippled, came to me whole. And that's what I find with short stories over the years. They've come to me as whole concepts. I don't have to think, is this a novel or is this a short story? I know what it's going to be. The form always presents itself to me. But I did start as a short story writer, and it took me a while to get published, but there were a few. There was a wonderful man called Noel Hoggard who had a little press called Arena, and I always remember him accepting one of my stories, and that was quite special. And there were not a lot of women writing in those days, and he accepted one of my early stories, and I was very touched by that.
I am quite intrigued. Like there's one short story in there, A Needle in the Heart, and basically it starts off from when she's a young child and it goes right the way through to when she's an adult. And within 20 pages, I've read an entire woman's life, and I've been, dragged into her life, and I feel like I've just read a novel. But it's only 20 pages. Oh, it took me 20 minutes to read, and it's like, how on earth do you achieve that? That's you're talking of a lifespan in a short few pages.
I'm really interested in the way that time can be used in fiction, and I've always been a great follower of Alice Munro, the Canadian writer's work. She is, I guess, to me, she won the Nobel Prize for Literature, writing short stories. And she modelled herself on Chekhov. Or she didn't model herself, but she always spoke of Chekhov as being her great inspiration. So I guess for me, Chekhov and Munro have both been considerable influences in the way that they use time and the way that you can take people forward and then back to so that you know what's happening to the characters before they know themselves. In other words, there's a sort of a line that's laid out for life, in a sense, which is sometimes difficult to escape. And Esme, the central character in that, doesn't really ever escape her. Well, she does. In the end, love is restored to her. And she's modelled on, she was a real person.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So who's that based? Is that based on someone you knew?
Yeah, she was my mother-in-law.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I did not know that. So she was not close to Ian for many, many years?
No.
Wow, I'm going to go read that again now. I recommend that you read it.
I've never said that in public before. Yeah, but it is true.
Did you write that when Ian was alive?
Yes.
And how did he feel about that?
Uneasy.
Siblings too, that he had siblings.
Yes, he did.
So so that must be a difficult thing when you're writing about people that you know, or you're writing as part of their story, and then having them read it and maybe take it the wrong way. I mean, A Breed of Women, 1979, that was your first novel. Huge, sold 9,000 copies in the first few weeks, 35,000 copies in a year, never got nominated for an award, even though I think the award winner that year only sold 350 copies or something like that. But this is Filthy Fiona that came out from this. But that was actually a story of 10 women that you had known, plus yourself, over your lifetime. And you wrote, it's about women emancipation, it's about, being able to choose lovers, sex outside of marriage and all of that.
Enjoying sex.
You weren't allowed to do that in 1979 if you were a woman.
No.
And you came from an incredibly close family. I mean, you grew up with aunties and uncles and you were the only child in that family, grandparents and stuff. And when the book came out, a number of your family never spoke to you again.
They did speak to me eventually.
Eventually?
Yes. I mean, they wouldn't. My aunts and uncles wouldn't have the book in their houses. But so and they said things like, "Oh well, dear, you did let yourself down a little." But because. And I mean, I've just said that is actually based on reality, but actually A Breed of Women was far more fictional than people assumed. And people did assume that it was exactly, Harriet Wallis was exactly the trajectory of it was exactly me. So I'd been a bit naive, I think, in the sense that that the character followed the trajectory of my life without actually having exactly the same experiences. But I mean, it's a girl comes from small country place, comes to town, moves to the city, works in television, all of those things, all of which I did.
You'd done, yes.
Which I'd done. So it was really fairly naive of me to think that people wouldn't say, oh gosh, that's your life. Yeah.
It must have been horrendous for you in the sense that you have finally got your first book published. It's selling phenomenally. It was banned from schools. It was banned from libraries. It was banned from your relations' homes. That must have been pretty sort of like, what a come down. I mean, I thought this would, I've got my first book published, but then there's all this negativity around it.
Yeah, yes, it was. And I remember the review that cut me to the heart was the one that said, ah, me. It was written by a man, of course. Ah, me, ah, woe, the thinking woman's Mills and Boon. I mean, I respect Mills and Boon's readers, and that's fine, but I didn't think that's what my book was. And it was hard, and I kind of kept myself to myself for quite a while. But in the end, the compulsion to write overrides that, and so I just wrote the next book. I mean, that's all you can do.
Because I did wonder that. Did you start to doubt yourself?
No, I don't think I did.
Good on you.
I mean, well, I was stuck with it. I was stuck with the knowledge that I was a writer, that's what I wanted to do more than anything else in the world.
The very first copy, or your first draft, you ended up incinerating out in your backyard. I think it was 110,000 words or something. And I read something, you'd said somewhere that you had these 10 women in your mind when you were writing the book, and you realised that they were all clamouring within your brain and they were taking over.
Yes.
And so you had to get rid of them taking over the book, and you burnt the draft and you started again. That must have been a massive learning curve, to not let the characters overtake your processes.
Yes, that's right. And it's also, I think, the process of entering fictional worlds, that the character became a character who was apart from those people. And so I could look at the character of Harriet Wallace objectively and let her have her experiences and be a real person. Yeah.
Well, you've done poetry, you've done plays, you've done short stories, you've done novels, you've done fiction and non-fiction in novels. What is your preferred genre?
Oh, whatever I happen to be writing at the time. I mean, I spent 20 years in the screen industry writing. I wrote soaps for years. I was the first woman writer, screenwriter in the country, and I started work on Pokemanu, and then I moved on to, I actually helped devise Close to Home, which I worked, which I worked on for years.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I did, and I worked.
Was that fun? Or
at times it was fun, but it's a much more pressured life.
I was going to say, there's pressure to get an episode out all the time.
Yes. And there's a lot of there are a lot of pressures within television. A lot of people wanting to climb to the top and so forth. I'm not a very collaborative person, and you have to be collaborative in television. But I could make more money in a month than a novel would make me in a year writing for television. And so I had to have jobs. And fortunately I had mostly writing jobs. But I wrote Close to Home, Shark in the Park, Pokemanu. I can't think of them all really now.
But you, as you just said, whatever you're working on at the time is your favourite.
I suppose so, yes. Well, that never was, of course. But what I would say is that I don't think anything is wasted in a writer's experience. And so across all the genre that I've had, I've learned things. From radio drama, I've learned how to, which I worked in for many years too, I learned to write dialogue. In television, I learned to look at the world through the eyes of a camera, which I found was helpful in writing concrete, vivid images, because you have to know, I'm not a good photographer myself. I'm technologically illiterate, actually, but you need to know what the cameraman needs to see so that they know their job is not to invent the scenes. Their job is to point the camera at what you've written for them. So I learned to look for detail. As a journalist, I worked as a journalist. I worked on contract for the Listener for years, and a lot of these jobs I did simultaneously. As a journalist, I learned to ask questions and to have experiences that I wouldn't have had. You know, I was sent in the 80s down to the Chatham Islands for a week, and I did a cover. They did their front cover article for that.
Is there any genre you haven't, or that you wish you'd done?
Well, I've done all I can think of.
Yeah, I can't think of any others. Because you've also liaised on movies with your own books.
Well, I have been a screenwriter, but I have never had one of my books made into a movie.
If you did, which book would you choose?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I've never been without an option on my books since 1981. The Film Commission have just never come across with the wherewithal to make one. What would this may sound a silly thing to say, but I don't really care anymore. It's not the important thing. It's not the important thing.
I'd like to ask you to read something from All the Way to Summer, because this is. I'd like you to explain why you've chosen this. It's Red Bell. It's in the very first section of the novel. So why, when we talked about it, why did you think to read this?
Well, I think that it speaks to the concept of the book, which is love and longing. And it is a new story. It's a contemporary story, and it actually starts. I'm just going to read the end page or so. It starts in a supermarket, and it's about just an afternoon when the narrator goes in. Meets a Cambodian person who's working in the fruit and vegetables section, and they have a conversation about him trying to get his wife
out to New Zealand.
Out to New Zealand. So he's longing for his wife to come. So that's love.
Love and longing.
Love and longing. And then there's a conflict with it. Because she's sort of being a bit distracted, the narrator puts some goods in somebody else's trolley. I don't know whether you've ever done that, but this person became very upset with me and suggested that said why had I tried to take her trolley? Why had I had to take her food? She was clearly somebody who was having some sort of life crisis, and I thought, quite hard up and sad and so forth. And of course, it wasn't. The food didn't belong to either of us at that stage because we hadn't actually put it through. Yes. But anyway, so that's sort of resolved, and so anyway, here's the last part of it. So this has moved on. A week has passed since this incident. Another day, another place, a week had passed. I was in the art gallery in Auckland. It is a beautiful gallery with high soaring spaces. I had been roaming for hours, transfixed. There was a whole room devoted to the pink and white terraces, the lost marvel in our history, consumed by the fire and ash of a volcanic eruption. The terraces were buried not far from where I had lived as a young woman, gone like the Temple of Artemis or the Colossus of Rhodes, the Themata, as the Greeks would say. The terraces so lost that nobody knows any more exactly where they are, even though this disappearance happened in a time when records and paintings had been made. I had encountered some people the day before in the hotel where I was staying. I had known one when I was young and he a child. We had spent an hour or more unpacking the past, who knew whom and how our lives intersected, old ties, histories and sorrows. The meeting had taken me back to another time in my life when I lived near the place where the terraces stood before they disappeared, before the eruption. I was shaken by this encounter, reminding me of my own metamorphosis from a wild and unhappy creature to a woman with a considered and careful life. I walked into another tall room, pale green and white, and stopped before a painting that took my breath away. The painting was called Focal Point. I had not heard of the artist, John Tunnard from Penzance. This work consisted of softly washed architectural shapes, of precise geometrical design which vanished at a central point, and that point was marked by a dark, intensely red sphere. I recognized that sphere in an instant. The flame in an opal, a shining fruit, a heart, a drop of blood, call it what you will. Beside the painting was an account of the artist's inspiration. It had come from a poem by Cecil Day-Lewis, written in wartime. So shall our time reveal long vistas of calm and natural growth, a pattern mysterious yet lucid, for love is the focal point of the pattern, and our ears shall unfold like a cluster of apple blossom in a fine tomorrow. That is how it is, I thought to myself. We trace our way through our shifting, precarious existence, questioning it over and again, watching out for landmines, sudden explosions, seeking the truth of every moment. There are losses and separations, and red beating hearts, and flare-ups wherever our gaze rests. Sorrows become wounds, and we each carry the burden of one another. But there is also love and the fine tomorrows.
Well, it's been a busy 7 years, as I said, since we last talked. I mean, you've written 2 novels plus released All the Way to Summer. Let's start with the first novel that you wrote, which I think was 2015. It was after our festival, All Day at the Movies.
Yes.
Stunning book, very different for you. It's a harrowing family saga that encapsulates more than 60 years. It begins in 1952, ends in 2015. It follows the lives of Irene Sandel and her 4 children. Jessie, whose father died in the Second World War, and she moves to Motueka, and she has 3 more children in her lifetime, Belinda, Janet and Grant. The beauty, or what I love about this book, is that every chapter is a different year, and it's a different voice. So we start with Irene's voice, and then, we go on to the children, and all the way through to 2015. You said to me on Friday night that it's actually one of your favourite books in that sense. But it is a very different book for you.
Yes, I suppose it is. Do you mean both structurally?
Yes, structurally, that the whole saga thing of taking chapters and putting them in years and things. I thought it was fascinating the way you've written it.
Well, I'll make a public confession here. I absolutely loved Elizabeth Strout's Olive Kitteridge. I just loved that book. And I thought, this is such a good way to, I liked the linkage there. So I actually wrote it as a series of short stories.
Oh.
I did quite shamelessly borrow the structure. But then my editor, Harriet Allen, said, this is actually a novel. This really would work better as a novel. And so we did quite a bit of work to give it more flow, so that it would be like a novel. So that's where it actually comes from. It's sort of accidentally a novel, really.
Beautiful characterisations, but one of the things that struck me, and it's probably because I had just read all the way to Summer about love and longing, and the 4 children, the 2 that were born out of love, real love, are the ones that go on to have happier lives. Well, not so much happy, but certainly Belinda tends to, whereas Jessie and Grant...
No, Janice and Grant.
Janice and Grant,
don't have good lives.
Yeah, they don't.
No.
Was that intentional? I mean, is that...
Yes. I mean, I've been very close to somebody like Janice, and I know that women's lives can be as difficult and sorrowful as that. And she is born out of a situation of desperation and so forth. And so, we talk about, we know intellectually, even whether we're engaged or not, that New Zealand has got bad things going on in it as well as good ones. And I thought I didn't want to shy away from that. And I tried, but you're quite right, there are 2 that are born out of love. Jessie actually is carried over from an earlier novel of mine called Songs from the Violet Cafe. Oh. She's a central character in that earlier novel, which was about several girls working in a cafe in the 60s. And I had at one stage planned to write a series of novels following more of their lives, but in the end it was only Jessie. And so Jessie is born out of her mother's marriage, and her father dies in the war. And then there's Belinda, who is, as you say, born out of love to a brief affair, but because of the circumstances, Irene marries this really awful man when she's already pregnant. And but Belinda's life is not...
It's not easy. It's not easy.
But she is rescued by love too.
As well.
She's rescued by the love of the man she marries and his family, who accept and take on whatever she does, and Seth, who is forgiving and loving. And so ultimately her life is okay. She finds her way to resolve the issues in her life.
The other book, A Mortal Boy, which won just about every single award it could possibly win, but, won for the books, excuse the pun, is that it won the Crime Award. And I think this is the first for you. You've written a book that won a Crime Award.
Yeah, I know. But, I've always had a deep... I'm interested in crime. I like crime. Well, I was very surprised. I was astonished but because it's not really a mystery. You know exactly what's going to happen from the beginning, but it's a book about a crime. I have written, tucked away in a couple of my earlier collections of short stories, there are 2 very long linked stories that have a body and have a mystery. In A Needle in the Heart, there's a story called Families Like Ours, in which a young boy goes missing, and it's how the family deals with it and how that mystery is uncovered. And then in The Trouble with Fire, there's also a body and a mystery. So, there is a sort of thwarted crime writer lurking in me. Yeah.
This is the book. It is actually available out. It's based on a true story. So Albert Paddy Black, who was the second to last person in New Zealand to be hanged. He was an Irish immigrant. Great doubts about whether he was guilty. But the story is set in 1952 around there, and it was a changing time in New Zealand. Sid Holland was the Prime Minister, and what I found quite fascinating in it is Sir John Marshall, Jack Marshall, who went on later to be Prime Minister, Gentleman Jack, as he was known. Your depiction of him is very, well, from that time, and it's based on research, is very different to the Jack Marshall that is probably in history books now. In fact, a quote from the book, Gentleman Jack, they call Marshall, some gentleman, Major John Marshall, you'd think he'd seen enough killing on the battlefields to be sick of it. Oh, but no, he wants more. I suppose that's why Sid Holland made him Attorney General. He was so in favour of the death penalty, and he really doesn't come out of your book very well.
No, he doesn't. That's true, and that shocked a lot of people. However, and I think I said this yesterday, in fairness, I believe that Jack Marshall was acting out of genuine belief, and how people's beliefs are formed during wartime and on the battlefields in those times, it may not be the same as ours. I acknowledge that for him, I do feel that there was some genuine element, whereas with Sid Holland, it seemed to me that his moral crusading, and he was the leader of that government at that time, was more political ploy. You know, Holland had swept into power in 1949, promising to improve the lot of farmers, or that's okay, but to break the power of the unions and to reintroduce the death penalty. And so that was, in my view, sort of naked political ploy rather than deep-seated belief. I think Jack Marshall was different. And what Jack Marshall says in the book, people have said to me, but he couldn't have actually said that. Well, yes, I'm sorry, those are actually quotes out of government papers.
Wow.
So the words that he uses are only the words that are actually used in government documents.
Oh, that makes it even more interesting. And it's an interesting book in the sense that you knew you had an ending, Albert gets hanged, research from Auckland through to Ireland. How did you decide where the beginning was? It moves backwards and forwards in time quite a lot. Yes, it does, yeah.
So I thought that we needed to meet Albert front on, you know, so the book starts simply with him. But as far as the research was concerned, I was enormously helped by a man called Redmer Yiska, who had written a book called, in the 1990s, called All Shook Up, which deals with the whole rock and roll bodgy widger era, and he deals with what was known as the jukebox killing, and he was immensely generous. I mean, we have a mutual thing. I'm helping him with a project too, but he was immensely supportive. He also had a lot of documents which would have been unavailable to me now, 25 years later. So he generously gave me all of those, and I forever bless him for that. And then I wangled myself an invitation to the Belfast Writers' Festival. I was in London because another earlier book, I think it was All Day at the Movies, was being launched in London at that time. Or was it The Infinite Ear? I don't know, I can't remember exactly. But anyway, I got my publishers to contact the Belfast Writers' Festival, and they invited me to Belfast, which meant I could actually hang out in Belfast for a while without too great an expense. And I mean, it was interesting at the festival. I was totally unknown in Belfast at that stage. They know about me now. But I had 7 people.
How many males?
I don't exactly remember.
We've been talking about how many males come to book festivals.
I think it was about half and half. Yeah. Anyway, well, one of them was that was very strange because one of them turned into my stalker. But that was.
Oh, really?
Yeah, really, yes.
In Belfast?
In Belfast, yes.
Oh, that's a bit scary.
Well, it was scary, believe me. But that's a whole other story. We'll leave that one.
Oh.
We'll leave that one in the...
Something that I did know nothing about until I read Immortal Boy is Is it the Mazengarb report?
Oh, the Mazengarb report.
Now, I don't know
yes.
whether any of you know about this, but this was a report that the government set up because they were very scared about the behaviour of teenagers. And we're talking in the 50s. Every single household in New Zealand was given a copy of this report.
Well, it was actually, I'll talk to that, but just before I do that, I'd just like to say, if I sound negative about Belfast, I had the most fabulous help there, and births, deaths and marriages, they're not into privacy at all in Belfast. They opened their books, they looked at, they became incredibly excited about the whole thing, and they gave me such a lot of help in tracking what the information down that I wanted. But the Mazengarb report, yes, the Mazengarb report was an inquiry into the morals of teenagers in New Zealand, and it was commissioned by Sid Holland, and Oswald Mazengarb was one of his best friends. They used to do magic tricks in each other's parlours after dinner and so forth, which is an intriguing...
Yes,
but he was a lawyer. He was quite a well-known lawyer, and he wrote a report on what was perceived as teenage immorality, bodgies and widgies, and the rise of American culture following the Americans in wartime New Zealand, and it had been said that there was in the Hutt Valley there was a lot of teenagers were having sex on the banks of the Hutt River, necking in the back of picture theatres and gathering at milk bars, and things were in a parlous state. And so he wrote this terrifying report, which was sent to every home, and that's not quite correct what's in that book, because it was actually every family that was receiving the family benefit at that time. But that meant that my family got because I was 15 at the time.
Did you read it? Can you remember reading it?
No.
You weren't allowed to?
No, because it might have given me ideas.
It's just a phenomenal thing that I didn't know anything about, and it's only sort of 60 years ago that we were that the government was actually trying to influence the way children were raised.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's like, I don't know, just into posting condoms to every letterbox.
Except that the postman wouldn't have to carry so much. I mean, the Mazengarb report was quite heavy.
I think it's Hell's Pizza that delivers the condoms, isn't it, to houses in the neighbourhood. They do in our neighbourhood.
Oh, we never got them. Did anybody else get them?
Oh, well, Wellington might be different.
Oh, yeah, that's that Hutt influence, I think, that's there. 2017, your beloved husband Ian, married for 57 years, died. And I know that he has been a huge influence in your writing with his suggestions, and he came up with the idea for you for a captive wife and lots of other things throughout your life. And it must have been very hard. I'm very, very sorry, because it's a massive loss. And before we go into questions, I think you would like to read a poem that is probably quite relevant.
All right,
Yeah.
okay, all right. I'll see how I go. So I do write poetry, and this little book is called Where Your Left Hand Rests. And we had a marvellously happy time when I was the Catherine Mansfield Fellow in Monton in 2006. And I did a series of poems that were... I tend to write poetry when I'm in a state of great happiness.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I'm not I try not to be a miserable poet. So this was written. We used to go up into the mountains. You could get for I think it was €1. You could get a bus into the mountain villages, and we used to do that a lot. And there's one, the garden at St Agnes was one that we were particularly fond of. So this is the garden at St Agnes, and it's for Ian. Hanging there in the rocks, the highest coastal village in all of Europe. The first challenge is to climb to the ruin of the castle at the very top, and the next is to climb back down. But somewhere around 800 metres, there is a medieval garden tended by 2 patient women. There were days when we needed to go to the hills to sit in the garden beside the low parterres shaped in crosses and stars, around the apple trees, to simply watch the small orange butterflies losing themselves in the spent tiger lilies, inhale the thyme and chives and potted sage, and watch the sheep of St Agnes grazing in all the dim, sweet green world below. If it was never more perfect than this, it would be enough and more. Dear, there is so much to remember.
Well, on that, I'd like to open it up to questions. Has anybody got a question for our doyen of the writing industry, Dame Fiona? Could you just speak up just a little? So,
You were saying having none of your books yet made into a film.
Yes.
That wasn't the important thing. So I wanted to find out what was for you the important thing.
Well,
What is?
as far as the films are concerned, it's not important because were they ever to be made, and I've lived with the anticipation of films being made because so many options have been bought on my books, but I have always had the view that if they ever were made into a film, that they would belong to somebody else. That they would be. I mean, Christine Lernans was talking yesterday about how the book became Taika Waititi's, and I've always understood that you hand over ownership of something, so it's not my thing that would be handed over. The important thing is, in terms of a writer, is that I'm able to say that, have the freedom and the will to continue saying the things that mean a lot to me. In terms of what's important to me in personal terms, I guess being the mother of 2 amazing kids, having 6 wonderful grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren is the centre of my life. And I've always been a person who's believed that you could live in the world as well as being a writer. I've never wanted to be in an ivory tower. I've always thought, there are some writers who've said, if I'm interrupted at such and such a time, I can't write again. That's not the way that a real writer works. A real writer just carries on with what is both their life's passion and also their job. And so it's been my job. But if one of my little ones comes up the stairs and sees me writing, I'm not going to say, go away. I have to live the life, and coming here is part of living the life too.
any other questions? Yes.
I'm just wondering, even though it was scary when you were stalked in Belfast, is it possible that it might be the catalyst for a novel in the future?
Now, I should say, I've said before, I'm actually very deaf, and I'm going to have to ask...
That was when you were stalked in Belfast, while it was very scary. Could that be the catalyst for a book?
I'm working on a collection of essays at the moment, and I have written an essay about that time, and I have written about being stalked. Yes, it was quite a terrifying experience, and it's only it's just within the past 3 or 4 years, and I have to say, at my age, I felt. Well, I guess any woman who's being stalked, but at my age I felt extraordinarily vulnerable.
Very.
Because Belfast is, although it has a smooth surface these days, it's quite a scary place. Yeah.
Oh, the lady behind you, just so you... No, yes, you.
In yesterday's session...
Could you just speak up, if you wouldn't mind?
In yesterday's session, when you mentioned that Black... At the time, his girlfriend was pregnant. Do you know what happened to the baby?
Do I know what happened to Albert Black's baby? Yeah. Yes, she's a lovely woman. I know her. Wow. She is married happily and she has a family. She was adopted out at the time. She has been reunited with her birth mother, but she has made a promise to her birth mother during her lifetime, while the birth mother is still alive, that she won't reveal either the birth mother or her own identity. Someday she will reveal herself. She really wanted to know about Albert's life, and she's been supportive of this mortal boy throughout the journey. The book is actually dedicated in part to her. It's partly dedicated to Ian, my husband, and also to somebody who's called E.H.
Did you know her before you wrote this, or did you?
Yes, I did.
Oh, wow.
Yes, so although it was a sworn secret, sometimes secrets have a way of leaking, and there was an intermediary who did know about it, and through a series of, I'm quite a good researcher.
Yes, you are.
I have my ways.
Yes.
and I made an approach, actually via her son, so Albert's grandson. And they're very supportive of.
It must be wonderful for her to actually know, and not only him, but his parents, their story as well.
Yes, that's right. She has also. I've been able to reunite her with Albert Black's real life family in Belfast.
Oh wow!
Which has been. There's not very many of them left.
No.
Well, but she is now in touch with a cousin, so that's something.
That must be a wonderful feeling.
Oh yeah, yes, absolutely. And I'm in touch with the relatives in Belfast too.
As well.
Yeah.
Oh.
So there have been a number of things, but just one tiny thing. All the research I did, I never visited his grave at Waikamete Cemetery. And about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I said, because I'm writing one of the essays I'm doing is also about the process of writing this mortal boy. And I got in touch with Harriet, my editor, and I said, how about have you got time to if I flew up, can you pick me up and we'll go to Waikamete Cemetery and look at Albert's grave? So we did go up, and all of that happened. So just a few weeks ago, I was standing looking at his grave. Waikamete Cemetery is a huge cemetery, and it's very, it wants you to know that this is a place about death, I think, because when you get there, there's a reception, and there are 3 women dressed from head to foot in black, and they have their hair dyed black, and they wear black fingernails with one red one and things. But they're wonderful people, and they help like mad. And the whole place is also ringed with, at that stage, I guess there's something else there now, but dark purple stocks with heavy scent. And I thought, this is really a sort of death reception area. But they were wonderful, and they helped us find this place. So Albert's grave is just a white cross with no name on it, and it's in a little gully which is swamp really, and it's sort of so lonely there. It seems so lonely there, covered over with rushes. I said to Harriet then, I think we should go. I think Alan Jacques, that's the boy who died, the other boy who died, the boy who was killed in the incident, I think he's buried here. So back we went to reception, and yes, they could tell us where it was, but there's a tiny little chip of a plaque which is sticking out from under the roots of a large and spreading Pahutakawa tree, and that's Alan Jacques' grave. And so here are these 2 poor, silly boys who got into this terrible quarrel. And here they are, almost side by side in death, and effectively disappeared to the world.
I think you had one final question.
Yes. You sound like you're still pretty busy with your research and your writing. What sort of structure do you have to your work?
Well, when I'm working on a project, I try really hard to work from about 9 till 1 each day. As I said before, I am open to distraction, but I can always pick up the work, and if for some reason or other I can't work from 9 till 1, I will work a bit later in the day. And a book usually takes me about a couple of years, really, because with the background work and preparation and research, because these days most of my work over the past 20-odd years has been to do with real-life characters who I've put into fiction. So Betty Gard and The Captive Wife, Jean Batten, and so forth. And that takes a lot of research. And so finally the time comes when I actually start the beginning of the book. And I put it off for as long as possible. But eventually the time comes, and then I really try to work regularly, and I aim to do 1,000 words a day. So that's, I can do more, but if I do more, I get too tired. I mean, writing is quite a physically exhausting and emotionally exhausting pastime, and so if I do too much, I'll be too tired to start the next day. So I try and pace myself. So that's how I work. And the book, at that point, I expect the book to take about 6 months. Yeah. So.
Well, Dame Fiona, thank you very, very, very much for being here for the second time at the Marlborough Book Festival. I did forget to mention at the start that Hunter's Wines were the ones that were giving us our beautiful wine and were the sponsors of this session. We've enjoyed that, haven't we?
We have indeed.
Now, there are books for sale, and Dame Fiona is very happy to sign them for you. But thank you, as Fiona said, for being here. And thank you.
Thank you, too.
At least it's not -3 inside here, isn't it?
So thank you again, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for being a lovely audience. Thank you, Tess. Thank you, Marlborough, for inviting me here.
We'll see you back in another 7 years.
Okay. Okay.
Oh. Thank you, my dear.
That was Dame Fiona Kidman speaking to Tessa Nicholson at the 2021 Marlborough Book Festival. A big thanks to all the writers that have supported the festival, as well as the audiences that attended in person or listened online. If you'd like to learn more about the event, head over to marlboroughbookfest.co.nz. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please do recommend it to friends and family. Thanks for listening.